Welcome, thank you for joining us, and I hope that everyone is doing well and enjoying the weather and making the best out of what can be, in some cases, a difficult situation. I would remind those of you watching that if you change your mind and you want to actually meet with us in person, we are meeting, but there will be some rules to follow. It's pretty straightforward. Make sure you come in through the front door off Nelson Street, and make sure that you're wearing a mask, and Dave will actually tell you everything you need to do as you come in the door, or whoever's seated at that front door table. You will be greeted and given hand sanitizer and all that stuff. So just keep that in the back of your minds. If in subsequent weeks you do plan to join us, I'll thank all of you who have been coming for both your presence as well as for your efforts to stay safe and, of course, make everyone comfortable. And I know we have some differences of opinion on exactly how this whole situation should be handled, but as Christians, we have a responsibility to one another to ensure that everyone who's involved can be as comfortable as possible. So thank you. I will add that we will also have our midweek service at Irish Mountain Lookoff, the way we have been doing. That's always been a really, really nice time, and the environment is great. The view is fantastic from up there. You can really appreciate creation, and because of the larger space and the greater distancing that we can achieve there, we don't need to wear masks, and we do some singing and things like that. So if you're looking for that opportunity, that would be a place. When we're here on Sunday, we're definitely going to be wearing masks, and we won't be vocally singing the way we normally would. Okay, those are two of the main announcements. I would remind you about the food bank. I know a couple of you have contacted me with food. If I'm here at the office, you can always the doors of the church are locked. That's sort of been what we've been doing during the whole virus situation. But you can call, you can ring the buzzer, whatever the case may be. I'll let you in, you can drop off your food, or now that we're meeting again, you can bring it on Sunday. So those are the main announcements I have for you. Of course, check your bulletin. There'll be some further information in there, especially included in that will be caring and sharing, so you can kind of have a handle on what needs may exist among our number and how you can help with that. I'd like to go into now a few moments of reflection pertaining to the Lord's table. So if you're watching this as part of your worship, you may want to pause the video now and then pick up in a minute after you've said a prayer, or prepared your emblems, or whatever you need to do, or sang a song, or however your particular at-home worship service is organized. Okay, now that we are back again, we're going to be looking in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, a passage I know many of you are very familiar with, and one that we've read often before, but it is simple and it is helpful. So let's go ahead and begin reading in verse 17. Paul writes to the Corinthians, "But in the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And I believe it in part, for there must be factions in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What, do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you." And I want to pause right here for a moment. Paul is saddened by the behavior in Corinth and the division that exists there, and the way that they are even allowing that division to extend itself into their behavior during the Lord's table. And he expresses his sort of reason for feeling that way here in verse 23. He says, "The instructions that I'm about to give you are not from me, Paul. They are directly from the Lord." And what I find rather compelling here is that, on the previous recording that we have of the institution of the Lord's Supper in the Gospels, we have Jesus instituting the supper, And now, here again, not by direct presence, okay, Paul wasn't at the first Lord's Supper, but we do know that Paul, on more than one occasion, claims inspiration. And here is another of those claims. I received from the Lord what I delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way also, he took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." And so Paul here is correcting some problems with the way that the Corinthians are observing this memorial. But I don't want to dwell too much on that. In fact, we have talked quite often about the unity that is supposed to be a big part of the communion. In fact, that's why we call it the communion. And certainly I don't want to minimize that lesson. But for today, I want to emphasize that we have Jesus instituting the supper. And we have a reminder here from Paul that this memorial was not our idea. Right? A bunch of people didn't sit around and think, we need a good way to remember what Jesus did and how he did it. And, what are we going to do? No, Jesus himself. Okay, these instructions are from the very one who is being memorialized in this time. And so we ought to reflect on that, allow it to inform what we do, and of course, be reminded then of how important this is. We often, in our own lives and in our own, whether it be work or personal lives, we give extra weight to the things that are done and said based on who did them, based on who said them. And in this case, we have, without a shadow of a doubt, the very words of Jesus directing us to observe this memorial. And I think that's a powerful thought. And I can't help but, I know I mention this a lot, especially during this time where we're not able to eat together, but I often think of all the Christians who have it in their hearts and minds to be obedient to him, and how they all, on the first day of the week, observe this memorial together. And I think there's encouragement in that. And there's encouragement in the reminder that the invitation to come and partake of this memorial was not given by, a friend or a family member or me or anyone here at the church. It's given by God himself. And I think that gives a lot of weight to how we ought to respond to that invitation. I hope that will be encouraging and helpful to you as you take time in your own home during your own worship service to partake of these emblems. This past Wednesday, as we met together to spend some time in devotion up at Irish Mountain Lookoff, it was a beautiful night. It had cooled off just enough. It was almost, the ideal situation. And one of the songs that was selected, and it often is because it's a favorite, is the song that probably is familiar to many of you. And it's the song, "Make Me a Servant." And we sing this song as a prayer, as a request. Make me a servant, Lord, make me like you, for you were a servant. Make me one too. Sometimes, though, I wonder if we think that by singing that song, we'll magically become servants. And so as I was thinking about us singing that song together, and I was thinking through the application of it, I thought, what would we do differently if we seriously considered ourselves servants? And maybe not all of these things will be different from your normal behavior, but I dare say some of them very well may be. And so let's talk over the next little while about what we would do and what behaviors we would develop, what characteristics we would embrace if we really made a vested effort to be servants. Right? If we meant what we said when we sing this song, "Make me a servant, Lord, make me like you." And so what I've done here is gathered some things that I think would connect us to a greater degree to the people around us that we've been sent out to serve. And I've gathered these thoughts around the idea of being servants. What are servants like? What do servants do? What characteristics would you think of when you think of a servant? Maybe if you were watching, an old-time movie where they had servants in their homes, or maybe if you just think of serving others and if you were to kind of make a list of what that might look like. So let's take a few minutes and consider some of the things the Bible tells us about Christian characteristics and how those are so in keeping with the Bible's message to be servants, to be like Jesus. And so the first thing that I want to point out here, and this is going to be an overarching principle for the whole lesson, is that servants pay attention. Servants pay attention. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4 says, "Let each of you not only look to your own interests, but also to the interests of others." And so we know from Scripture itself that we ought to be paying attention to what's going on around us and to the needs that are present in the lives of those who we spend our time with each and every day. And guess what? When it comes to our effectiveness at reaching the world, it's going to make a big difference because people appreciate and people notice when we take an interest in them. Especially in times like these. And I don't mean because of the virus, but that does exacerbate things. But really, I mean this digital age where so much of our time is spent interacting with one another through a screen, and our voice and the voices being given to us are often just one of millions. And when your voice is just one of millions and you don't know who's paying attention and you don't know who reads this and cares at all, there's great value in knowing that someone is personally taking an interest. Someone personally wants to know what you have to say, what's important to you, what's valuable to you. And so James reminds us in James chapter 1 verse 19 that we should be, I think this is something we all know well but sometimes forget, quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. We ought to be great listeners. That's the primary way that we let people know that we're interested in them. Okay? And so what does that mean? That means when someone is talking, we look them either in the eye. Now, if you look someone directly in the eye for a long time, it's going to get uncomfortable. But we pay attention to them. We focus on them. We turn our feet toward them, okay? By the way, you can look around a room, and if you want to know who's really not engaged in the conversation, look at their feet. If someone's feet are pointing away from the person they're talking to, even if they're facing them, even if they're looking at them, they don't care. They're ready to move on. And so we need to make sure that our body language, that our focus are all indicating to people that we're interested, that we care, that we take an interest in them. And so to be a good listener, think of some of the practical ways that we can do this. Ask questions. A good rule of thumb is when you're listening to someone to ask them initially the question, this is what I heard you saying, and repeat back to them what you think they've been saying to make sure that you're accurate. And I have had people, when I say, so are you saying such and such? They'll say, oh no, that's not what I'm saying at all. So that even if that happened to you one time, that would be a good warning to say, hey, make sure that you're understanding properly what people are saying to you. But also by asking that question, that reaffirms to that individual that you've heard what they've said, that you're interested, and that you want to respond appropriately. And then once you've done that, ask further questions that will carry the conversation along. So ask questions like, so let's actually give a real example. Okay, so you could say, do you like hockey? Right? And that the person's going to say, yeah, I do, or no, I don't. But perhaps a better question would be, what's your favorite hockey team and why? Okay, perhaps your favorite, a question that would be helpful would be, what do you think of, right? Fill in the blank. All right, just starting a sentence with "what do you think of" kind of makes it so the person has to elaborate a little bit and give you some further information, and it allows them to talk. And by the way, people love to talk. People love to know that someone cares what they have to say. Now, in addition to being a good listener and asking good questions, we need to remember what people have said. So maybe we have to use memory devices. I know people do this. They'll say, this person, I don't know, has a certain hair color, and that reminds me of some characteristic of them that I can bring up in conversation. Not everyone is super good at that, but maybe you can take notes. Maybe you can record something on your phone after, Bill from sales and marketing, has 5 kids and likes boating. Whatever the case may be, just to remind you who this guy is and how he fits into the world. And the next time you see him, guess what? Number one, you're going to remember his name, because you took the time to make that little note about him, but you're also going to remember some other things. Maybe you ask him how his kids are doing in school, or when was the last time he was able to get the boat out or go golfing, or whatever his interests happen to be. All right, so we pay attention. If we are good servants, we're going to be paying attention to the people that we want to serve, so that we know what their needs are and we can do the best job possible meeting them. Now, in addition to paying attention to people, we also need to pay attention to our surroundings and to the world in general. Matthew chapter 10, Jesus sends out the limited commission, and he says, "Behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." Taking some time to know about our surroundings and about the circumstances that people are in and that we may face ourselves is going to be highly valuable as we try to effectively serve people. All right, now listen, we don't want to be taking up all of our time watching the news and looking at social media and just obsessing over what's going on in the world. That's not healthy. Neither is it healthy to be a busybody or a gossip. Right? In fact, that's sinful. So we definitely don't want to get into that, but we do want to maintain some general awareness of the world around us and the potential impact that it could have on us and those that we love. Knowing the predominant ideas and habits and trends of our culture will help us to avoid negative situations and to know about potential problems before they arise. And so paying attention not only to individuals, but to the circumstances that those individuals are living in is going to be helpful. Servants pay attention. Secondly, servants know their value. One of the saddest things that I see from Christians is Christians who don't know their place in the world, who aren't confident about the value that they bring into this world. Not just because they're the people of God, but because of the opportunity that they represent for anyone, anywhere that they come in contact with, to have a potential avenue to reach God and to learn of his truth. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 20 says, "We're ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. And so we implore you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God." Now, when we don't know our value, it undermines our ability to reach out to people. We feel like we don't have a message. We don't have anything relevant to offer the world. Now, I will say this, that the condition of the world these days hopefully is serving as a reminder of just how relevant we are as Christians, just how badly the world needs the salt and light that Jesus says we are in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. I would remind you of Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22. Now you may say, what does this have to do with it? But let me just say, first of all, that as we think about the influence that we can have on the kind of people we want to be, on the way that we want to be thought of, how important is it that our characteristics are the kind of characteristics that are attractive to people, that draw people to us rather than push them away? And so the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such, there is no law. As servants, we represent our master, and we want to do that in the very best way possible. Our presence may be the only influence some people ever have for good and light. It may be the only opportunity they have to know God's truth and God's grace. And so we need to understand just how important our role is. Now, let me hasten to add that being light is not always easy. Okay, and I've used this before, but I'm going to use it again. If you have one of those little lights in your backyard that you can turn on that kind of illuminates the back porch, what do you notice about that light? There's certain animals, moths and insects, okay, that will be drawn to that light, and in fact so attracted that you'll have a whole swarm of insects buzzing around it. So light definitely has the power to attract. But what does it do to the raccoon that was going to get into your garbage, or the neighbor's cat that was sneaking across the back, or the fox that was bringing some food through to its babies, right? You turn that light on and those animals, they're gone, right? They're out of here. And guess what? In our lives, in your experience and mine, we're going to find that light attracts some people, but it repels some people. And that's okay. We can't compromise who God has called us to be. Now we need to be, we don't want to be abrasive, and we don't want to be miserable, horrible people and say, well, I can't help it. Light just repels some people. Well, it's not always light. Sometimes it's your attitude, okay? But we need to know that there is an aspect to being the light of the world, to being the salt that is going to push some people away, all right? But let me remind you that despite the fact that you may face some negativity, you never know the impact that you might have on someone. Even someone who kind of puts you off, even someone who, is you perceive as one of those people who's driven away. I can't tell you how many times I've had experience with those very people coming to me and asking questions and looking for help and wanting to develop a further relationship with God, just in such a surprising way. And I always think to myself, imagine if I had treated that person in the way that I thought they kind of perceived me, rather than being gracious and kind to them because I kind of didn't get the kindness that I was expecting. Right? So you don't know how big of an impact you may have on someone's life, and you don't know what people are noticing. They're often noticing far more than you realize. Now, the last one is a little bit difficult. The last thing that servants do is what they're told. Right? If you think of, the traditional way of thinking about a servant, this is someone who has a master. This is someone who's, told to do this and do that and get this and put that away and clean this. And, they're always worried about, taking directions from the individual that they're serving. Now, primarily, we've been talking about serving our fellow man, and we ought to do that. However, when it comes to serving our fellow man, it's not really going to work for them to direct us, okay, for them to tell us what to do, because our job is different. Remember, Jesus in Luke chapter 11, verse 28 said, "Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and keep it." Okay, we are God's servants. And while it's true that servants obey, we don't want to misunderstand this to mean that somehow, we should be compliant pushovers to every single person that we come in contact with. And when you think of the example of the greatest servant who ever lived, Jesus was anything but a pushover. He was not this meek, mild individual who everyone thought they could push around. That's not how it works. However, he was an exceptionally good servant. Now, in our case, we have to remember, of course, that we serve God above all else. Remember, Peter and John, Peter and the apostles explained in Acts 5:29 that we have to serve God rather than men. Right? And that didn't mean, that doesn't contradict what we've been saying. It just means that it's our service to God that motivates us to serve our fellow man. It's our godliness and compassion developed through our relationship with God that makes us compelled to reach out to those around us. And so our service to man isn't motivated by compulsion, right? A servant has to do what he's told these days because he's getting paid, okay? Back at some time it would have been because he was owned and he was, under penalty of death if he didn't do what he was told. Well, we're not motivated by compulsion like that to serve our fellow man. Our service to them is based on our love and devotion to God. And so we do what's best for our fellow man, not always what is wanted. Okay, and that's something we have to be clear and certainly somewhat careful about. Jesus served all people, and this is a real challenge. Okay, sometimes we feel good about serving those who, I don't know, we get along with. We kind of feel like they're in a similar, station in life to us. We're comfortable around them. But Jesus spent a lot of time around people, serving people that we would not feel comfortable around, or we may not feel comfortable around. Listen, as we look at Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, Jesus, it says, was having dinner at Matthew's house. Many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw, they asked the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And on hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." When it comes to serving, we have to remember who it is we're serving and not to be selective about it. In fact, it's often the people who are most difficult, most off-putting, who need the most service. And so we need to reach out to all people, knowing that we ultimately serve God and He loves everyone. He's not selective. In fact, He's extremely inclusive. That's one of those special words these days. Nothing is more inclusive than the gospel. And so we have to keep that in our hearts and in our minds as we seek to be better servants. So we've talked a lot in this lesson, but also in previous lessons, about seeing the world and seeing people as Jesus saw them, specifically thinking of people as Jesus thinks of them. And the most central aspect of that, the core principle there that we ought to be developing in our own hearts and our own lives, is compassionate service. We need to pay attention to people. We need to pay attention to their needs. We need to understand the valuable and important impact that we can have on their lives and on the whole world. And we need to know that our service to others is an expression of our service and devotion to God. When it comes to service, when it comes to treating people the way that God calls us to treat them and being their servants and taking an interest in them, there's a powerful story that I want to share with you from Dr. Jerome Motto. This doctor had a patient who committed suicide from the Golden Gate Bridge. And this happened in the 70s. And he relates the story as follows. And I think it reminds us of how critical our role as servant really is. Dr. Motto says, "I went to the guy's apartment afterward with the assistant medical examiner. He told me the guy had been in his 30s, lived alone, had a pretty bare apartment. And in his house, he'd written a note and left it on his bureau. It said, 'I'm going to walk to the bridge. If one person smiles at me on the way, I won't jump.' We may never know the impact of our expression of God's love. We may never know how important it is for us to fill the role of a servant and what difference we're making in the world around us by filling that role. But what we should know, and what I want to remind you of and let you know with certainty, is even though you may not know the specifics of the difference that you can make, you are making a difference.